So thank you, just waiting for numbers to tick up. So a warm welcome to people joining us. My name is Ed Turner. I work at Aston University in Birmingham and also chair the International Association for the Study of German Politics. We are delighted to be collaborating with our friends at the British German Association, which is a leading organisation promoting links between Britain and Germany and deeper understanding of our two countries on this event. And we set this event up at a time when it looked like the results of regional elections in Thuringia and Saxony might well be cause for discussion. And that has, as we, I think, all know on this call, been very much the case. So the first time that the far-right party has topped the poll in Germany since the Second World War, and clearly a difficult set of results for people to digest. In doing so, we've got two leading academics to help us, Christian Stecker from Darmstadt and Jasmin Riedl from the University of the Federal Armed Forces in Munich. Both of them, in different ways, are outstanding scholars of contemporary party politics and also particularly have things to say about these elections. So the idea is we will pass over to them. They will offer some introductory remarks, both on the results, but also analysis based on their own research. We'll then have a discussion. We've got an hour scheduled for this event, which should be fine. You should see a Q&A button, I think, in the bottom of your screen. So very happy for people to type in questions, and I will try and put them, sort of group them together and put them as best I can to our presenters. And Christian, Jasmin, don't worry about that and things popping up. I'll sort of try and do the moderation there. One other thing to say is that this event is being recorded. So if anyone was wanting to take loads of notes, then don't worry too much. You will have a recording, hopefully, to look back on. If anyone objects to that, then drop us a line and we'll see what we can do. But our speakers have kindly agreed to be recorded, and that's the main thing. So I guess it's just something to bear in mind if you're putting things in under your name in the Q&A box. Without further ado then, Christian's agreed to kick off. I think, Christian, you mentioned you've got a couple of slides to share as well. So thanks for taking the time, and over to you.
Thanks, Ed, and good evening, everybody. In German, we have a lot of nice composite nouns. One of them is Katastrophentourist, that is sort of tourists that only visit certain sites because they were recently struck by a catastrophe. So in a sense, I welcome you as joining me as a catastrophe tourist in observing the results of the German state elections. And I like to start to recall what was the catastrophe all about. And I'm going to start with the first smaller catastrophe, that is the state election in Saxony. And here you see a screenshot of the results from national TV, and you see that by a small margin, the CDU managed again to end the elections ahead of the AfD. Michael Kretschmer, the prime minister who was heading a Kenya coalition of Greens and SPD, is sort of one of the most important figures in Saxony, and he managed to distance Jörg Orban, who's a rather calm protagonist of his party, but at the same time a friend of Björn Höcke. And Michael Kretschmer managed this with quite an intense campaign where he visited many rural areas of Saxony, arguing with people and talking to people. But at the same time, he was quite pessimistic in the end of the election, said that, well, he's not able to reach many of the voters that intend to vote for the AfD. This share of votes translates into this seat distribution, and the seat distribution, this is already clear, doesn't allow for any coalition that has been experienced in recent years in Germany. So this already ideologically very heterogeneous coalition of Kenya, that is CDU, the Greens, and SPD, lost its majority. And there is basically, if you do the math, only a coalition of CDU and CDU and AfD, which is excluded because of the Cordon Sanitaire or the Brandmauer. And sort of the only viable, also I hesitate to use the word viable coalition, would be CDU, SPD, and BSW, that is Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, sort of the new party that managed out of the blue sort of to gain so many seats in Saxony. So, but this is the most likely coalition that we will witness in Saxony. Let's turn to the much bigger catastrophe. Let's put it like this. This is the state of Thuringia, where for the very first time the radical right-wing AfD, in a very radical extremist version, one has to say, managed to outrank all other democratic parties. So Höcke secured almost 1/3 of the votes in the state. And the Linke, that is the former PDS, the socialists, headed by sort of a social democrat, at least with regard to his positions, Bodo Ramelow, really lost many, many votes and only ended the race as a third party. And Mario Vogt and its CDU managed to sort of win the vote within the democratic spectrum. And it is now up to Mario Vogt and the CDU to do some, to make some sense of the seat distribution. And the seat distribution is really crazy. It's sort of precision engineered for chaos, because not only do all coalitions that existed previously have no majority, there's basically no viable majority of a three-party coalition like in Saxony of CDU, SPD, and BSW. It's exactly missing one vote. And I think only Thüringen could be the stage for such a chaos. So it's basically up to the CDU to find any way, either minority government or a really, really impossible coalition of with SPD and BSW, and maybe with the addition of the former Prime Minister Bodo Ramelow to get a majority in the Landtag, in the state parliament of Thuringia. So just to sort of remind us what happened on Sunday, and what I want to briefly present before I hand over to Jasmin, are results of an original survey we had in the field in Saxony and Thuringia, to sort of give you an impression of the peculiarities of voter preferences and voter markets in these two states in the East. What you see here are thermometer scores, sort of where you were asked to rank parties according whether you like them or dislike them, and this is grouped by the voters of different parties. So here, for example, you see the CDU and how much CDU voters like their own party and dislike other parties. And what's interesting is maybe that CDU voters dislike BSW, the BSW party, but not as strong as the AfD, for example. And BSW voters in turn are also not that negative about the CDU. So there is, even though this sounds like really crazy, that the CDU, who has a cordon sanitaire towards the left party, and now the personnel that gave the reason for this cordon sanitaire left to the BSW, that this CDU is out to form a coalition with the BSW, is, at least from their voters' perspective, not that impossible. Here, I hope you can identify the dots. Here you see questions on political preferences and how voters of different parties positioned themselves on these different issue dimensions. So this, for example, is a question about redistribution, asking whether government should reduce economic inequality. And when you position in this quadrant, you agree with the statement, and here you disagree. And what you see, and this is also known from other surveys, that Eastern Germans in general are a bit more open to redistribution of all kinds than, for example, in Western Germany, especially when you look at the voters of the FDP, which doesn't play any role in the East, but compare this to the West, you see that even FDP voters are a bit more positive towards redistribution than in the West. And you also see that the BSW has like really a new offering. as it combines pro-redistributive policies with more sort of immigration skeptic policies, to which we come in a second. And you see that the support of the Ukraine is like a really important conflict dimension in the East, where the AfD and the BSW are, BSW, are really against continuous support of the Ukraine, whereas SPD, Greens, and also the Left Party, interestingly, Left Party voters are more in favor of supporting Ukraine. Finally, you see here, down here, that there is really an important distinction to be made between the migration of asylum seekers and sort of this economically utilitarian perspective on voters' migration. There is basically an agreement between voters of all parties, except for the Greens, that asylum migration to Germany should be restricted. Unsurprisingly, the AfD voters are strongest in favor of restricting asylum migration, but closely followed by voters of the BSW and the CDU. The picture turns when we look at workers' migration. There we only see that AfD voters are still moderately against voters' migration, but all other parties are rather in favor of additional workers' migration. And this, is somehow, I think, an important distinction in one of, I guess, the most important conflict dimensions we currently have in German politics. So thanks, and I hand over to Jasmin.
Thanks very much. Loads of food for thought there, Christian. Jasmin, let's turn to you now. You're a particular expert as well on social media, which apparently played quite a role in the AfD's appeal, but look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Okay, so thank you, Ed, and thank you, Christian, for taking lead in the introduction. So when we talk about the success of the AfD now in this election, in many ways, the question of the role of social media pops up because, like, for example, if you remember the European elections and how, I don't know if you recognized it, how in Europe it was talked about the role of TikTok, for example, for the European elections. And if you checked who was like the front runners or the top leading parties on TikTok in Europe during the European elections, it were all like the far right populist parties. So now with respect to the elections in Saxony and Thuringia, I thought I can give you some short insights I tried to analyze for you for today. So the first thing I can say and I figured out is, like, when we compare how toxic the chatter is towards parties. So in posts on platforms, on different platforms where parties are mentioned, and if you compare it from the last federal elections in 21, and then I have analyzed the North Rhine-Westphalian state elections, the Bavarian state elections, and now, like, for Thuringia, and Saxony, what we could see is that the chatter got more toxic. So we see a slightly increase. So what we see also when we open up the newspapers, for example, that it's more like polarized, that we see more aggression. Also, like, people are attacked when doing work for the election campaigns for the different parties. We also see on social media. And what we also see is, and here I would like to share my screen for a moment. Let's see this one. Just a moment. Oh, yes, now you should see it. And if we now do not compare, like, the different elections, but only take a look at the state elections for Thuringia, when we only take a look not on TikTok, I will come to TikTok later, but if we check how the chatter is about the parties on the platform X, so former Twitter, we see that we see not only an increase from election to election in toxicity and also in civility of the language, but also we see slightly differences between the parties. So what is pretty common is that the AfD so the chatter about the AfD is less aggressive, because the AfD, as one of the far-right parties, is one of these front runners who gained a lot of also positive attention and can mobilize their supporters on social media, on Twitter, pretty well. So, but in comparison, we see that, for example, the Green Party in Thuringia was has the highest degree on uncivil language in the post with the party mentions of the Greens, but the most highest was, as you can see, the SPD. So that was pretty interesting for me to see, because I expect these results are also pretty new for me, but I was expecting, of course, that the chatter towards the Greens could be pretty aggressive. But towards the SPD, I did not expect that. And another thing, so if we now take a closer look at another aspect, which is relevant when it comes to uncivil language on social media towards politicians, is the differentiation between female and male politicians. And here, again, something that pretty surprised me regularly, so like from a research perspective, and also what we know from surveys, is that the chatter, the online talk towards female politicians is more aggressive. So they receive more what we call like verbal violence online. But in Thuringia, it's not that clear, the picture. So what we see, the lighter ones, the yellow ones are the females, and the darker ones, the more orange ones, are the males. So separated like those politicians from the AfD, here are the females and here are the males, and you have like this for all the parties. This is important to know. This is for all the parties from which I have enough data on the platform Twitter that is separable between the genders. So this is why you do not see all the parties here. For example, the new BSV is not listed here because we do not have enough data on separation between male and female politicians. But also here, pretty interesting. It's not like this clear picture that at least I know from research on verbal violence and gender. So no clear picture. Another point is with respect to Saxony. When we take a closer look at the similar analysis of Saxony, also again, like females are the lighter ones and males are the darker ones. Here we have more this picture, what we know from the literature, that against female politicians, the talk is more aggressive online compared to their male colleagues. So this is only like a little kind of an insight I wanted to show towards or with respect to the kind of language, the tone towards politicians in these two aspects on Twitter. So what we see is here, just again, this one, Thuringia, for example, you have like for the AfD, less aggressive talk, especially compared to the Greens and to the SPD. And I can also show you like the same one for Saxony. Here, the picture is even clearer. It's like less than 20% of the posts where an AfD is mentioned have uncivil language inside, but like more than 25%, like almost 27% in such posts where the Greens are mentioned. So, but one thing is so what at least I think is one of the questions I hear, I'm asked, but also what I read in newspapers, for example. So what is the role of these kind of social media for election results? So is the AfD does the AfD gain such good election results due to the fact that it's, for example, discussed more positively on social media, like on Twitter, or because it's so active and successful, for example, on platforms like TikTok. And what I can say you, of course, such platforms are important due to the fact that all the parties make use of digital campaigning and use like the platforms to get outreach, to inform about their program and to mobilize especially their supporters. However, I'm sorry that I'm like skipping forward and backward between my slides, but I just like this one. I just prepared it, and yeah. But what we see is that, for example, on a platform like TikTok, it might be that we have here. Can you see my mouse here? This one? Yes. No. Thank you, Christian. So what we see, for example, I only took the official Thuringian state party account of the AfD, just to give you one example here. Of course, the party gets a lot of likes in relation to what it posts. This is the amount of data you see here now. This results is from the last months of the election campaign. Okay, so from beginning of August till the beginning of September. However, for example, the Greens got much more likes for what they posted in relation to what they posted, for example. So it is too short and monocausal to just say, like, if you are successful on TikTok, if you have a good social media strategy, you can gain good election results. And also another point, of course, we still see in the big picture that still the far right parties, or in Germany the far right AfD, is very successful on various platforms. So on X, on TikTok, also on YouTube. I could also show you some data from YouTube later if you like, or if you have questions towards YouTube. So they are, in the big picture, pretty successful, but we see also that other parties slightly and slowly start to get more outreach on the platform, especially the Greens, but also like very small parties. For example, for the European elections, we had the same with Die Partei, which is kind of satiric party that was super successful on TikTok, or the Volt Party, for example. Yes, and I think that's it.
Thank you so much, and colleagues, we just particularly appreciate the fact as well that this is you're sharing original insights from research which you've been working on, and it's a real privilege to hear that. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A already, and really encourage people to use that, and I promise I will pick up on them. And I might actually, if I may, just sort of come up with one puzzle, which maybe I'll pose to Christian first, if you don't mind. Also, again, if you don't mind me saying, I think it's an Eastern voice on the panel, Christian, as well, which is just about the East-West dimension here and what's going on. There was a tendency, maybe 10 years ago, to say there are parts of Eastern Germany that are doing great, that really look like the West, also in terms of their sort of voting behaviour, and there are areas in Western Germany that feel quite left behind, and maybe have lacked investment, and they feel like parts of Eastern Germany. And people, I suppose the hint here was that there's nothing terribly special about the East, and if we simply drill down into other questions of how regions are faring economically in particular, maybe also something about attitudes, then we end up with similar looking results. But the European elections and these elections here seem to be telling, on the face of it, quite a different story. I mean, do you have any reflections on really what's going on? Again, a common Western German narrative in particular is we paid our additional taxes for 3 decades. And what we're now getting is this terrific sort of vote of no confidence in the existing institutions of the Federal Republic. There was one part of the exit poll that the public broadcaster did where around 3/4 of people, voters in the state, said they felt like second-class citizens. So I'd be really interested in just your reflections on that Eastern dimension and what you think is going on here, if that's all right. And then we'll come to 2 very interesting questions in the chat as well. Jasmin, I'll certainly give you a chance to comment, but let's turn to Christian first.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. To just pick up this picture you painted, that so much Western money went to the East. One blunt answer to this would be yes. In fact, there's a lot of Western money that was used to modernize houses in Leipzig and Görlitz, but at the same time, these houses are now owned at around 80% by Western Germans who live in Western Germany and who sort of rent these houses. And this is part of the narrative, and there's some truth to it, of feelings of de-evaluation of many Eastern Germans that cannot be healed simply with money. Of course, there was a steep increase in the wealth in the East, but at the same time, also many hardships, like regions where many people, especially women, left towards greater job opportunities to the East. And it's exactly these regions where the AfD fared really, really well in the European and also in the recent election. And then there are all sorts of other factors that are, I think, beautifully assembled by a book of Steffen Mauer, and also founded in surveys. That's to summarize this briefly. There was from the beginning like really weak party identification in Germany, and newcomers like the BSW or the AfD found it much easier to attract new voters because there was no sort of long legacy of voting Social Democrat or voting Christian Democrat. So sort of the Eastern Germans are somehow postmodern consumers who pick up on interesting parties and offerings shortly before elections. And maybe one last sentence. The AfD really, really managed it well to depict itself as a party for the Eastern Germans, which is not without irony, because much of their leading personnel, including Höcke, comes from the West. But yeah, Höcke drove on a Simson, which is like a motorbike that was produced in the East and is somehow a sign of identification. And there are all sorts of plays of the AfD, successful plays of the AfD with identificatory symbols of the East German, and it somehow replaced the left party at sort of Volkspartei of the East Germans.
Thank you. Much food for thought there. Jasmin.
Yeah, I like to add something to what Christian said, to what I all agree. So one additional point after reunification is that like right extreme groups and subculture really used or made use of this, how can I say, the space that civil society space that opened up after 1990. And that was not like occupied by the traditional parties. As Christian said, they were not like able to build up ties, to build up roots, like to get into society and, I don't know, like binding people in society. And the very extreme right were able to do that. And so we also have, like maybe not in these more pluralistic cities like Leipzig, for example, but outside the centers, we have also a strong youth culture, extreme right youth culture. And this corresponds to the fact that we have a higher amount of people who hold extreme right attitudes, who are more authoritarian, hold authoritarian aggression attitudes, and these kind of things. And what is maybe a thing that is newer since 2015 is the fact that although we had these ties and attitudes before 2015, with the AfD, the people found a kind of a party where they can group behind. So before we had like the NPD here or there, and they were also in state parliaments, but the AfD was more able, or is probably more able to tie these people behind. What I don't want to say with that is like that all people who vote for the AfD are right extreme. This may be a core, I don't know what Christian says towards that, but I would say like 10%. So 1/3 are like core voters by core belief, who are more like into these far right attitudes with all these native things, and also, but the others they take it into account. So, you know, like, okay, it's like this, it's a far right party and they support native attitudes, but probably they make us a populistic offer against this whatsoever corrupt elites.
Super. Thanks very much indeed. We've actually had some interesting follow-up in the Q&A on some of these topics, but maybe let's range a little bit more widely first before coming back. An immediate question, which your talk actually begged as well, but which is being much debated, Christian, is about just the feasibility of a CDU-BSW coalition and how that might work. And looking from the outside, some of that feels like just how much we were talking beforehand. Sarah Wagenknecht insists on some declaratory points or even substantive shifts in foreign policy, or whether you sit down with people that used to be at the moderate end of the left party and have a conversation about transport policy in the region in question. And there've certainly been some noises from people engaged in foreign policy in the CDU that they would feel uncomfortable, but I'm not sure they have any great solutions on what to do about it. So, you know, how could this play out? I mean, if I push you, Christian, in a very unscientific way, what are the chances of a coalition involved in each state involving the Sarah Wagenknecht alliance coming to fruition? And then, you know, the obvious follow-up question Nick Wright puts in the chat is if you don't get one of these, if it doesn't work out, do you end up with new elections at some point?
Let's start with the last question, which can be answered a little bit easier because it's an institutional one and it's an interesting variance. I mean, in Saxony, you have pretty clear rules on when the state parliament has to convene and elect the prime minister, and if they fail, this could lead to new elections. In Thuringia, there are no such provisions. So one potential trajectory will be that Ramelow will, for quite a long time, be geschäftsführend, sort of provisionary prime minister, and the minority government stays in place. So in Saxony, there's more pressure. And I would also argue that before Brandenburg, we won't hear anything substantial about which way parties will go, because if they're a little risk averse, they won't send any signals what kind of coalition they try to signal and then maybe antagonize voters with regard to Brandenburg. And sort of this precision engineered seat distribution for chaos in Thuringia and in Saxony, I could well imagine that a coalition with the BSW, is on the plan for Michael Kretschmer. And it's a little easier than in Thuringia because they have enough seats. In both states, the joint collaboration with the BSW is of high risk for the CDU, both with regard to inner party debates as well as with regard to the perception of the voters, because on some dimensions, one could argue they're pretty close to one another. For example, refugee policy, they're pretty well aligned, but at the same time, like anti-Americanism, support of the Ukraine, this would like really question the tradition of the CSU as a transatlantic party, all right? And sort of forging this into a coalition that in Germany is always a coalition with perfect unity is of very high risk. And the risk's name is like really Sarah Wagenknecht, because I think her agenda is focused on the federal elections in the next year, and she will use the Thuringia and Saxony as a stage for her political agenda with regard to the federal level. And if she decides so, she might force what she also already announced, to force like the TU in Saxony and in Thuringia to sort of sign a resolution or introduce an initiative to the Bundesrat, criticizing the support of Ukraine and a call for negotiations with Putin, what the CDU, of course, can't actually do. At the same time, on the ground, the personnel seems to be pretty pragmatic, especially in Thuringia, where with Katja Wolf, a mayor of a city of Eisenach, where Luther went to school, is sort of leading the BSW. So as long as, or let's put it like this, the more Sarah Wagenknecht gets into the equation, I think the more difficult it will be to form a CDU BSW coalition.
Thanks very much indeed. Jasmin, you wanted to come in on that, and I'll bring you in on that. But also maybe if I could put to you Mark Castle's question as well. Mark is, I think, probably challenging the starting point, but it's a good challenge that we would assume that the firewall will hold, and his thought is that at some point the firewall stops holding. And his question is, what substantive difference would it make if you had the AfD in a state government, if any? So, reflections on coalition. In fact, you can even engage with my kind of challenge for percentage likelihood of it being formed, if you want. And then reflections on the sort of substantive difference that an AfD-led government might make if such a thing came to pass.
So, but beforehand, I would like to add something, because what we have not, because Christian already said that the BSW is also trying to take this energy now for the next federal election. So another question might be, are they probably prefer kind of a majority government? Because what is the price for the BSW to now go into a majority government, so form a coalition with, I mean, limited stuff, limited resources, and it's a huge effort. No, it's a huge work. It's huge work to form a government now, and ministers and all that stuff. And probably, I mean, if they are in the state government, they have to fulfill demands from the voters, and they may also fail, no, and this can be negative, have negative effects for the federal elections. But with respect to the AfD, and if it would make a substantial difference if they are part of a government or leading the government, and if we have a Höcke as a prime minister, I mean, the far right, and they are right extreme there. No, it's not only radical, right? It's entirely not comparable, and working with liberal democracy. And there are many possibilities. You can make decisions against what liberal democracy stands for, and you do not always need like a 2/3 majority, like for changing the constitution or something. No, you can also below like an absolute or qualified majority. You can make major decisions that are more in favor or against what we understand under and what we want from our liberal democracy. You can shorten, for example, funding for democracy projects. You can influence who is working with the media, so in the Rundfunkrat, for example. You can skip the so-called Rundfunkstaatsvertrag, and you can influence the media and how in what way the free and politically independent media can work, for example. So only to name a few. So to make it short, it would be a total disaster for liberal democracy if the far-right AfD would be in government.
Thanks very much indeed, Jasmin. I think quite often this question is raised with an assumption that the AfD would go on the same sort of journey as far-right parties in Italy and maybe France, with a degree of moderation.
And also look to Hungary, no?
Yeah, a very fair point and fair challenge. I mean, my impression looking in from outside is that, if anything, the sort of stronger role played by eastern parts of the AfD, particularly Björn Höcke, takes it in if anything, a more radical direction. There isn't any great sign of sort of compromise such that it would expect to hold office. And call, if it did, it would call the system into question into ways you describe. Christian, you may have some thoughts on that one, but let me also just put quickly another question to you, then some other specifics. But you mentioned that you thought parties would hold off doing anything dramatic until the election in Brandenburg had happened. I also wonder whether the SPD might have further reflection on what to do after Brandenburg, but won't want to rock the boat before. But do you have any predictions based on this, on what might happen in Brandenburg? And in particular, one thing which I saw in some of the reporting is that maybe there was an element of tactical voting, particularly in Saxony for the CDU, in order to see the AfD come second. And if so, that would surely be a good omen for the SPD in Brandenburg, because it is best placed to beat the AfD. So, Christian, maybe bring you on that one first.
Yeah, thanks. Let me briefly join in on the Brandmauer discussion and maybe break up the liberal democracy consensus a bit. So, for the sake of the argument, let's put it like this, because a contradiction would be that if we take electoral democracy by its words, it's increasingly problematic to exclude 30% of the voters, which we actually do with the Brandmauer. And the recent government of the left in Thuringia had the effect, and in conjunction with the Brandmauer, had the effect that all political decisions were basically dragged towards a left-wing minority, basically. And regardless of what I think of these substantive issues, it's simply problematic from a perspective of electoral democracy. And the CDU, in my perspective, is the party that gets the most pressure, both actually within the party and also from outside. Sort of the costs of the Brandmauer are highest for the CDU, because they would have a lot of majorities for their own positions. I mean, this traditional spatial logic of minority governments, the CDU would be well positioned to lead a minority government, and already in the last term, and to really propose own positions that are not negotiated with the AfD. If it was only about sort of spatial positions, then the CDU could have gotten their way. And some of the historic irony is that the Brandmauer is somehow the revenge of the left for the Rote Socken campaign. So it's the Red Sox campaign, right? When the CDU sort of stigmatized any collaboration of social democrats with the left party, and the left party was, in my view, stupid enough, if I may say so, to really exclude left-wing majorities in social policies, because one couldn't do policy with regard to foreign questions with the left party. So to your question, at Brandenburg, tactical voting, yes, I think what you have to do as an East German party leader that is not in the AfD is to frame the race as a horse race with the AfD. This is what Rainer Haselhoff in Saxony-Anhalt managed to do with the help of a poll right before the election that saw AfD and CDU head-to-head. And this really leads, we know this from research, this really leads to tactical voting of voters of all sorts of parties that want to avoid that their state is a state where the AfD is the strongest party. This worked out well in Saxony for Kretschmer. It didn't work so well for Thuringia, for Vogt, because the lead of the AfD was much too high, and it will work out pretty well, I guess, for Voigtke, SPD in Brandenburg, because they are head-to-head in the polls. And in terms of, yeah, maybe I finish here because everything else in terms of predictions towards Brandenburg is highly speculative. I would say, because I think you hinted towards this possibility, we won't see anything happening with regard to like the federal coalition, because the usual exercises telling, yeah, disastrous results, and we have to show a better profile in the federal coalition, but in brackets at the same time, the situation in the East is so specific that we don't really can transfer this results to the federal election in 2025.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll skip on with one or two particular questions, but there's huge amounts of thought there, and do keep the questions coming. So Andreas had quite a specific question to Jasmin, asking about the seemingly small differences in uncivil language between parties. What do you think your data explains in terms of differences in vote share, except that lefty tweeters seem to be more polite? That's not always been my experience of lefty tweeters, but there we go. And that's a good question. Jasmin, if you can come to that, and then Christian, I'll also sort of tee you up. There's going to be a question coming your way in a moment about the changing composition of the Eastern electorate, but also one about sort of, maybe you hinted about that actually in an earlier answer, but about inputs into politics rather than outcomes from politics. So tee you up for that in a second. But Jasmin, first of all, on what your data shows in response to Andreas.
So, I mean, I would, of course, I mean, it's not this case that we have like for one party uncivil language of 10% and in the other case of 50%. So in this sense, the differences are not that big, but we have like differences from almost about like 10 or 8% or something like this. So, for example, between AfD and the Greens. And what does it explain? In the moment, it doesn't explain anything. In the moment, it only shows what are the differences. No, and it is more like that it is in the same line with what we know from former or earlier research, what we have also observed in other elections. For example, when we did for the other elections live monitoring of how online communities talk about the parties, we always see that comparatively seen the AfD stuff, the AfD politicians get more positive voices, get more positive stances, are formulated, are articulated towards AfD stuff compared, for example, to the other parties, especially, for example, the Greens. So it is more in line with this, and it shows that the online community are generally more polite, more nice towards the AfD people than to the, for example, the Green parties or other parties like the SPD. We had it here in this example. What does this indicate? It indicates that the AfD is better, and this is also what I know from other things, like we see very clear mobilization actions from very small AfD accounts, for example, like regional AfD accounts. They make like strong mobilization actions online, and that the AfD is good in mobilizing their community online. And this is what we see then with respect to these results. What does it tell us? It tells us about like voting results? Nothing. This is actually, and especially like, for example, with the incivility or the tone about a party. The online chatter is relevant for parties and their election campaigns, as I said, for mobilizing their supporters, for example, or for publishing, for example, negative campaigning against their counterparties. But we have no, as I said before, we have no, it is not valid to conclude from online activity or the positivity or negativity of online chatter directly to conclude on voting results. This is something we cannot do. What we can do, like for a single party, the ups and downs for a single party with respect to how the digital public talks about these parties online. For a single party, we can see these ups and downs are corresponding pretty well with what we see online and what we see like offline in surveys. This is something we checked a few months ago for the research we did, but it's nothing you can, you can make conclude for election results, for example.
Terrific. Thank you. Jasmin, a heads up. I'm going to turn to you in a second to return to that, the sort of challenge Christian posed around, if you like, excluding a third of voters from government with this firewall. And Andreas just put a further bit of challenge in the chat about, if we claim the federal republic's institutions are resilient, why should we be so concerned? Because I think it's a really interesting debate. So come to you in a second, because I think you have a different take on that. But first, there were a couple of maybe slightly related questions for Christian about the sort of earlier discussion we had about Easterners. One was Mark was wondering about how much of this is down to depopulation. And I think there's an interesting point there. It might be people are upset that there are limited employment opportunities and many have to leave, but it might also be that the people who are left have a different view to those who previously departed, and so the composition of the electorate's changed. And it'd be interesting to get your sense of which one's at work here. And then also, Andreas, I think you picked up on it a bit when you talked about Stefan Mau's work, but about being how much of this is about if putting it in layperson's terms, a sort of lack of involvement and engagement with decisions and frustration that way, as well as with policy outcomes.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. Exactly. I mean, a part of the explanation of why the AfD is so strong in the East and so relatively weaker in the West is really a composition effect, right? In some regions, many well-educated women moved to the West, leaving sort of a male society of frustrated Remainers, who sort of, as themselves, are more likely to vote for the AfD, and also sort of propelled some dynamics that simply lead to a radicalization of Remainers, of male Remainers. At the same time, there was also an influx of Western Germans to the East. I think about 20% of sort of people living in Eastern Germany are Western Germans, but these people usually entered sort of the society on top of the society, sort of Überschichten, in a sense, and they rather live in the city. So specifically the rural areas of the East are strongholds of the AfD. And Jasmin also pointed to an important mechanism. There are many sociologists would call Geselligkeitsvereine, that is football clubs, and the kind of, but no weltanschauliche political unions or churches. And this empty area was like really filled by the AfD, particularly in the rural areas. Andreas also raised a really interesting question about, if we put it like this, to what extent like input legitimacy and output legitimacy is important for understanding democracy in the East. And indeed, one could argue, and also Stefan Mau argues like this, that input legitimacy in the East has quite a hard time. On the one hand, it is because, well, these institutions, if I may say so, we didn't build these institutions as Eastern Germans, but they were transferred to the East, which made it maybe hard for people to identify with them. And sort of this whole debate whether we should have made a entirely new constitution to allow like for a broader identification with a new unified Germany. Then we also know, particularly from Steffen Mau, that East Germans have quite different conceptions of how democracy should work. So many subscribe to the notion that elites should do what people want, and there's a widespread notion of that there can be something like a homogeneous folk, homogeneous people. And what is really problematic is that the readiness to engage in parties is pretty small. Eastern Germans, one could say, we only have time for a sketch, rather take it to the streets, because this is also their political empowerment moment, right? They have learned from the peaceful revolution that you can take it to the streets and change things, and not to engage in the institutions of a representative democracy. And then there are really interesting phenomena that a Landrat, sort of a councillor in a rural area, or a mayor of a rural area, organizes these Monday demonstrations, which you wouldn't really have in the West, because there you are integrated in a party that is also active on the national level. But here you have really missing party structures that spawn across the local, regional, and national area. And yeah, Eastern Germans are much more focused sort of on the output dimension of democracy, and they expect a lot from the state, are at the same time pretty much skeptics towards the state and also the elites that represent the states. And it's also full of inconsistencies. And interesting question is to what extent we really should work with this inconsistent popular theory of democracy, and to what extent we really have to change people and their convictions to make democracy work. And one proposal of Steffen Mau is that, we should work with citizen councils to sort of drag Eastern Germans or people more generally into politics, so that they understand that it's about compromising and respecting your fellow citizen, even if he doesn't or she supports your opinion.
Christian, thanks so much for that really rich seam of insights. And it actually reminds me a bit of some scholarship done on sort of citizen party linkages and political participation in countries in Central Eastern Europe as well, and also the relatively high volatility of parties there, parties coming and going, relatively low levels of party membership and so on. And maybe sometimes the analytical lens that we take is the kind of Western old Bonn Republic analytical lens, and maybe there are more useful comparisons, but that's hugely rich. Thank you very much. Jasmin, the sort of challenge came a bit from Christian. He said, for the sake of debate, a third, if you exclude a third of voters from government, that's not a good look. And in addition, it drags the CDU into unnaturally centrist policy positions, the hint being opening up space, I guess, further to the right. Andreas made the point pointedly in the chat, shouldn't institutions be strong enough, I paraphrase, in the Federal Republic to withstand someone like Hooker taking office in a small and weak eastern state, and what do you want to do, wait until he gets an overall majority? I mean, that wasn't where you were going before. You weren't, I think, arguing for the trying to detoxify the AfD by putting them in positions of responsibility. What would your response be to those challenges in defence of the firewall?
So, I mean, if I understood you right, if not, just correct me or ask again. Sorry. So, with respect to institutional mechanisms to protect against this far right party, and I don't know, Christian maybe can support me in this case if I'm wrong or if I do not have it in mind correctly. In general, if we have, for example, a far right or a party that does not conform with respect to what we understand under our constitution, for example, how we do want to live within our state and democracy. I know that there are some kind of institutional mechanisms the federal government can force a state government to change, for example, laws again that are not in consensus with the federal constitution. No, right? This is so at least like one aspect to as a kind of a checks and balance mechanism. No, do you know?
Yes, yeah, it's called the Bundeszwang, right? And sort of when state government actions hurt the Bundestreue, sort of the truthfulness towards the federal level, then they may rein in with the Bundeszwang. Yeah.
Exactly. So, but on the other hand, with respect to these 30% of voters, to just like exclude them, I like from an electoral perspective, and also from like the input legitimacy perspective of democracy, I would totally agree to Christian. But on the other hand, we have this so-called like wehrhafte Demokratie, you know. So we should also like defend the democracy or defend democracy from those people those forces who are not conform with the constitution and the democracy. So this is a kind of a problematic situation. And on the other hand, like as Christian pointed out, a very important point, like on the other hand, the governments and also the legislators, they have to make policy outputs that conform also with what the demands of the society. And obviously, this is something that is not working or not successful. This kind of like fulfilling the demands of the Eastern, or part at least like those people who vote for the AfD, but also for the BSV, no. So they also, obviously, legislators in government, in the state, but also on the federal level, are not able to give a proper answer to the demands that are made. And this is something that I find pretty problematic. So I mean, like Christian already said, we have these rural areas from like more men or older peoples, and those, like, you can wrap it up like it's like people who feel themselves like in a huge distance to political, economic, and cultural centers. No, they are probably have a good income, or they are probably well educated, but the feeling is there. And this is something ones have to respond to and really have to take serious. And this is something that really like I'm thinking a lot of. Why is it like that these people are feeling themselves so far away from politics, society, economy, and culture, from what we as living in the centers think is the way we want to live? No.
Super. No, absolutely. Thank you very much. And we need to wrap it up now. But for me, these elections have been a difficult insight into contemporary Germany. But in this discussion, we've also surfaced some really important questions about the way contemporary Germany works, the way, even taking us back to the process of reunification, about the strength and resilience of democracy or otherwise, about the way party politics ought to work, about the way the public engages with politicians. It's been a really cracking discussion. Very, very many thanks, Christian and Jasmin, for giving up your time once again. Thank you to everyone who's contributed, either simply by joining or particularly by fielding questions in the chat, and in some cases answers. That's been good fun too. If you're interested in these things, be sure to get yourselves on the mailing lists, if you're not already, of the British German Association and the International Association for the Study of German Politics. Do join the BGA because they're very wonderful, and keep your eye out for more events of this nature. Thanks to everyone, and let's see how the story progresses. Good night to one and all.